We're just waiting a few seconds for everyone to come in. There we are. All right, it looks like everyone is in. Thank you everyone for joining us today. This is the first in the fall 2020 series for the colloquia for the program on education policy and governance. We are delighted that you've come to share your time with us. We have today a wonderful talk with Kate Walsh, Professor Paul Peterson, Henry Lee Shattuck, Professor of Government and Director of the Program on Education Policy and Governance, will moderate for us. If everyone could just hold their questions toward the end. We're using the Q&A feature. You can type in your question at any time. We'll have that portion of the presentation in the event later on, and we'll call on people as we can. The very next talk that we will have is coming up pretty quickly. It is on Thursday, October 1st, and let me just double check. The actual talk that's coming up is Thursday, September 24th. It is next week, where we will have Michelle Rhee and George Parker, a former union leader. So without further ado, if I could turn this over to Professor Peterson.
Hello. Thank you, Antonio. Antonio Wentland is the Associate Director of our program on education policy and governance, and he's been working very hard to make sure that we can have our PEPG seminar series available to you all, and perhaps even more available to you all, since you can participate even though you're scattered around the country and maybe beyond the country. So thank you for joining us, all of you. So Kate Walsh has since 2003 been the director of the National Council on Teacher Quality. And in that role, she has had a profound impact on people's understanding of the importance of a truly effective teacher and going beyond mere pencil and paper qualifications. So it's just a thrill for me to have the opportunity to introduce you to her and to give her the opportunity to share her wisdom with you all. So thank you, Kate, for joining us on the program on educational policy and governance webinar series.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here. And let's just get right to it. I'll share my screen. Oops, let's say, try it again. Okay. Right before we started, I said I had this all ready to go, and I do, but there we go. Okay. Okay, everybody see that okay?
Not quite. There it is. No, it's
okay. Good. So those of you who know me know that I speak rather frankly, and sometimes I think my high school teachers wanted to figure out how to make Kate Walsh, Kate Bernard at the time, a little bit more diplomatic in her approach. But I also think that that can take some of the fun out of talking. So I hope you don't mind my my approach here today, but it is grounded in fact, I hope, and you'll be perhaps a little entertaining at the same time. So I'm going to just give you a little history lesson. I think it's useful or instructive to understand why teacher preparation has struggled so mightily to be what it needs to be. And so I'm going to go through what states and the federal government and what the field itself have tried to do before I start talking a little bit about what it is that we could do to change the quality of teacher preparation, which by everyone's measure, not just mine, but people on the inside, people who are big champions and defenders of teacher preparation, there are almost no people who stand up and say it is what it needs to be by any stretch. So let's figure out how we got to this point. I promise not to talk through every bullet point here, but you can see the sort of flip-flopping that has occurred over the years in regards to how states control teacher preparation. It has been one of just simply not knowing what to do with this animal. It is a relatively new field, which explains that too quite a bit. But on the other hand, you can see that the states have done, 100 years into this of having something called teacher education, they have yet to figure out what their role is. They know they're in charge, but they very seldom assert their authority with programs. They have things called program approval. They have licensing tests. They have flirted with value add methodology where they can track the graduates of programs into the classroom, and they were hoping to tie that back into a program's performance and do and come up with a metric for whether programs were adding value. Simple, but that went by the wayside, but for actually legitimate reasons. I think it would have gone by the wayside if there weren't legitimate reasons, because the field was so opposed to it. But there are legitimate methodological problems with trying to use value add to hold programs accountable. You can't look at that. A lot of states expected to use evaluation results, but with most states and most school districts still reporting 99% of all teachers to be effective, that too is a pipe dream. And now we're in a downturn, and it's a very disturbing downturn. There is quite the movement afoot to get rid of licensing tests, that they hinder diversity of the teaching force. And the problem with that is, yes, licensing tests do produce disproportionate performance of whites versus Black and brown candidates, but states aren't putting anything legitimate in their place. In fact, in one very prominent state, which is known to be extremely active with its teacher prep programs, they recently approved a policy that they would investigate a way to measure content knowledge without using a test. And I asked the person who was in charge of that for the state, I said, well, what is that going to be? What's that look like? How do you measure someone's content knowledge without actually testing them? And she said, I have no idea. I'm just doing what my board said. We're going to spend the money, and we're going to see if there's some way of figuring out if we can measure content knowledge. So right now is not a good time for what states are doing regarding teacher prep. Let me show you the more pathetic intervention by the feds in this area, which has been mostly hands-off as appropriate by the dictates of our Constitution. But they, most notably, George Miller, who was who was in charge of the Education Subcommittee in the House. When the reauthorization of the Higher Ed Act came around in 1998, he said, you know what we're going to do? We're going to require programs to report how well their candidates do on their licensing tests. So we'll look at the pass rates on licensing tests. And so this law, the horrible fighting about it. Teacher ed did not want to see it happen. And so instead what happened was, as soon as the law became law, interpretation of it became, it was rather clever on the part of teacher ed. They said, okay, we don't define anyone who hasn't passed their test as someone who has completed a program. Therefore, we're going to report 98, 99, 100% pass rates on these tests. So the US Congress has basically had to admit defeat, even though they tried to come back in 2008 and fix this loophole, but they have not. That's some of that. And then Obama comes in office, and Obama appears quite promising in terms of his determination, or with Secretary Duncan, to hold programs accountable. And they spent 8 years working on a new accountability measure. I think they completed it in October before Trump was elected. And I think on the second day that Trump was in office, he dumped the new accountability measures that the Obama administration had spent 8 years putzing around on. Really, God only knows what they did for 8 years, but they didn't do it in time. If they had just come out with it 6 months previous, it would have probably stood. All right, so, and then lastly, I want to look at what the field has done, because this is probably most telling. You know, almost every field has professional accreditation: nursing, doctors, engineering, and there's just been nothing but problems getting schools of education in the United States to buy into the idea that professional accreditation, well, they all think they should be professionally accredited, but they don't think they should have to do something to become professionally accredited. So even some of the better education schools have eschewed the notion that they should be accredited. And so in 1990s, there was a renewed effort to assert accreditation requirements on programs, because in no other field do you operate without accreditation by your by your peers. And so teacher education is unique in that only half of the programs in the country, while they continue to churn out teachers, they don't actually have to seek accreditation, and they can operate, and the university lets them. And so what the accrediting body known as NK did, they decided, well, we'll make states require programs to seek accreditation. And that was quite successful. The only problem was that accreditation didn't mean quality. And there have been some folks who have written about that, notably Arthur Levine, who wrote about how meaningless accreditation is. So states started requiring it, but it didn't stand for anything. And then there was a real strong effort by a Harvard graduate named James Cibulka, who is now on my board. He was brought in to bring new healthy standards to the profession about who gets in, what it takes to get out. Cibulka was absolutely run out of town by the organizations that represents teacher education, the schools of teacher education. So basically accreditation fell apart. And now what we're left with is a period where accreditation is hanging on by a thread. It still exists, but it is again splintered into multiple groups. And then in the meantime, to combat what was going on with the states with trying to do value added, and the feds, what they were trying to do with the Obama regulations, the field said, you know what, we're going to hold ourselves accountable by requiring every teacher to pass a performance assessment. And they were out there really beating the drum that performance assessment called the EdTPA, but there are other ones, was what's the silver bullet. It was going to all of a sudden raise the quality of teacher preparation in the United States. But as soon as the accountability threats went away, all of a sudden the field got very lukewarm about performance assessment. They're a lot of work, they're very expensive, and they set the cut score so low that it's not clear that people are actually being blocked from entering the teaching profession on the basis of quality. So I hope I've not depressed all of you too much, because it is a depressing story, but I do think there are real reasons for optimism. And that's what I'd like to get into now. We can pause. Would this be an appropriate point, Paul, to pause for any questions, or should we just proceed?
Yes, I think this would be fine. So if we have any questions at this point, we don't have any questions filed here. So why don't we keep going? I think they're waiting to hear about the way forward. So let's go.
Okay. All right, good. So what will work, and what my organization has been arguing is that public comparative data is the answer, and because it works, it absolutely motivates institutions of all kinds, including Harvard, including anyone who want to rise to the top on public comparative data. It's being used, you can use it in a way that's probably less combative than the way NCTQ has had to use it. And that's something we always are reflecting on, how to be a little bit less combative with our data, and make sure that it is motivating, not defeating, because there is so much ground we have to make up. But since 2013, NCTQ has been applying a set of research-based standards, such as, do these programs teach future teachers how to teach reading? Do they know enough math to teach third grade math? Do they learn something about their content knowledge, their subject matter knowledge? Do they get a good clinical experience, or do they require that the folks who are mentoring their student teachers, do they require them that they be good teachers, which is kind of a no-brainer, but research does support the importance of putting student teachers in with teachers who are considered to be effective. So we've been applying those standards, and we're having some real, it has absolutely been not without controversy. It's been, and we're learning how to do it better. But I will say that we are seeing real movement, especially in reading instruction, and we're having new results come out in a few weeks that will look at classroom management, and we'll show some real increases in program adherence to what is research-based, because that is behind everything that we are saying, that the field needs to be evidence-based and not teach whatever a professor likes or thinks makes sense, but only what is evidence-based. And so with those standards grounded in research, we are hoping to move the field, and in many areas we have evidence that we are. And this is the movement that we are able to report is the first effort in a long line of efforts to reform teacher education that have actually produced any systemic results. And so we have real reason to be encouraged about that. But you know, we're at the beginning of, we're on the uphill part of the curve. So the other thing that we think is extremely promising, and we're doing our bit to do what the U.S. Congress couldn't do, We are collecting pass rates on licensure tests, state by state, open record by open record request. This is a labor of love, to say the least. But it will be when we believe we'll be able to report what programs are doing in about 30 states by next February when we release our first report. And this will be the first time that there has been any outcome measure that's been published that's meaningful on licensure tests. In fact, if we had more time, or maybe during questions, there's some tawdry stories behind the efforts to prevent these data from being made public. Our ultimate goal, though, is not for NCTQ to be the reporter of this information, but for states to report this information.
So let me ask you, Kate, this question. You say that you've got some outcome measures. So what are your outcome measures? What are these 30 states going to be reporting about this intervention that you have designed?
So what we've asked for is their elementary licensing tests. So what elementary teachers, their preparation for in their content knowledge, but probably even more importantly, how to teach reading. And we're looking at their pass rates there. And so we're looking at the first time pass rates of candidates on these tests. So there is huge variation among programs. Between many programs are well under 50% of their candidates being able to pass these tests. We don't attribute that to the candidates. We attribute that to the field not taking these tests seriously. They sort of treat it as something the state makes them do, but it's not something they own.
So I have a question that came in on the Q&A function, and it's from Austin Batson. Austin, would you like to pose the question yourself?
Hi, yes, can you hear me?
Yep.
Perfect. So I was just wondering what some of those stories were to resist the efforts of publishing those data. Was it from states? Was it from the programs themselves? Was it a mix? What were their reasons? I think that would be very interesting to hear.
Yeah, it isn't a pretty story. Doesn't speak well of any of us, but basically states have very much allied themselves with their teacher prep programs. Not all states, but many of them, and that continues to be the case. They see this as data that belong to the programs and not to the public, even though it is the state administering these tests and it's the state saying this is what you need to do to become a licensed teacher. So we've had the test publisher, there are two test publishers, ETS and Pearson, and we've had them tell us stories that states have told them, don't give us our data because a group like NCTQ might ask for it, or so they've actually rejected even considering looking at this data, that it isn't a concern to them. They've been told by some states, we want our data, but we will meet you across state lines, because if we meet you across state lines, it won't be subject to an open records request. When we've gone out to states, we've had more luck than we thought we would, but we're still got 20 states which have not responded to our request. Then we have states, we've had states turn over data to us. In fact, I'm going to be doing a talk later this afternoon for some folks in Kentucky, and they showed me their pass rate data, and they said, here, this is what we got from our publisher, and it's absolutely fiction. If it is misleading, to say the very best of it. The report that the test publisher was giving is not a lie, but it leads one to make conclusions about pass rates, which is absolutely false. And it's a complicated report. I would have to display it, but so this is what the test publishers have been giving states and teacher prep programs themselves, who have told us, oh, our pass rates are great. We don't know what you're talking about. And then we explain to them what the report from the publisher really means, and they can't believe it because their pass rates suddenly get halved. So the efforts to keep these data from seeing the public eye are nothing less than you know, it's a bit of a scandal, I believe.
Yeah, Austin, you have a follow-up?
I was going to say thank you. And the publishers are misleading that data, so the states or the programs just think that they're doing better than they are, because that doesn't seem like it would necessarily benefit the publishers in the long term as well.
No, it doesn't benefit the publishers, but apparently it's benefited them until now. We were the first to call them on it.
So I want to ask a very simple question, Kate, which is how many teacher preparation programs are there in the United States? And is this, you know, what's your assessment? Do we have enough, or do we have more than enough, or how do we compare with other countries in that respect?
We have so many more than anyone else in the world. It is remarkable. If you controlled for population in China, we have 6 times the number that they have in China. You know, we've looked all around the world trying to find anyone else that has this Wild West system. We have 1,450, roughly, give or take. And within that 1,450 are multiple programs. So you have an elementary program that's undergrad, you'll have a graduate elementary program, you have a secondary you know, it goes on, art therapy, gym, phys ed, whatever. That makes it impossible for states to really exercise authority. I was talking to the folks in Massachusetts, and they have literally thousands of programs they're supposed to approve. So when their state board has to approve all these programs, it tends to be very automatic because you can't possibly have a meaningful process.
So I was on an advisory committee to a school of education in a very prominent university in a very big state. And it turned out that every little field had its own licensure tests and requirements. And so one of them was in art. And it turned out that the 2 professors at this university took a great interest in those licensure requirements, because those licensure requirements ensured that they would have a steady enrollment of students in their classes, which if otherwise they might not have any students at all, because they weren't particularly effective, is what we concluded when we looked at what was actually going on. But their enrollments were protected by the fact that students just simply had to take those courses if they were going to be able to go and teach art. Have you encountered that elsewhere? Is this an anecdote that doesn't have a plural to it?
I can't put a plural to it, but my experience has told me that a lot is driven in the field of teacher education to keep enrollment up. I think a lot of people don't realize that the nation has, for example, been producing elementary teachers at twice the rate of those that we need. If that happened in, you know, the AMA would never tolerate such a thing. So there are a whole heck of a lot of people, the profession is way out of line with what schools need to hire. but it's also important that it be way out of line, because a lot of schools don't want to hire a lot of the graduates of many programs. They need a lot more to pick from, even though they've been fully licensed. A lot of deans will tell us that many of the decisions they have to make regarding the selectivity of their program are driven by the university saying you need to get your enrollments up.
Well, how do you, you said that there's so many teachers graduating or potential teachers graduating from these programs, twice as many as are actually needed. I
At the
thought,
elementary level.
yeah, so we hear a lot about teacher shortages, maybe not so much right now, but just a couple of years ago, this was a big topic. So how can you have teacher shortages and so many people graduating from these programs that half of them aren't needed?
Well, the national teacher shortage was created by a reporter at the New York Times who did a story on how 8 school districts in the country were having a hard time hiring teachers. And apparently what that story served as was she lit a match. And within no time at all, there were what everybody was talking about, there being massive teacher shortages in America. Were they wrong? We do know enrollments fell in a lot of teacher prep programs over that period. And the reason they fell, no one is quite sure why, but we do know that when the economy is very healthy, fewer people enter teaching. So we're about to see a period where we expect enrollment in teacher prep to go way back up because the economy is no longer healthy. But more importantly than whether or not there was this, all of a sudden this dry, the labor market had dried up. More important than that is that there continued to be chronic shortages in teachers available for rural areas, teachers available for STEM, special ed, teachers who are willing to work in really high poverty schools. Those shortages have existed for now decades. But we refuse to use basic labor market rules to get teachers to work in those places, which is to pay them higher teacher salaries. I had a debate with Linda Darling-Hammond on teacher shortages because her organization, Learning Policy Institute, was being very active in fanning the flames of a national teacher shortage. And I went through the numbers, how we had actually hired 400,000 more teachers in the time that with the student population staying static. We had actually hired 400,000 more teachers during this period of supposed shortage. And her defense was, well, we did put a question mark in the title when we said a national teacher shortage, question mark. So that was her defense. I do think that there are real shortages in real places, but they are not that much different from the shortages that were there 10 years ago, 15, 20.
So you talked about teachers not being paid enough in STEM subjects and so forth. So maybe you could just talk a little bit about, well, okay, so what is the compensation practices that generate these kinds of teacher shortages?
Well, we act as if we have a policy that says that a teacher who is teaching in Montgomery County, Maryland, which is one of the wealthiest counties in the country, should be paid the same as somebody who is teaching in a district that is 100 miles from the nearest Walmart. There's no sensitivity to to the need to pay teachers more in some areas than less, or any kind of stipend from the state. There are states that are providing stipends. There are districts that do provide stipends, but it's not a systematic. It's not nearly systematic, and it's not nearly enough to really persuade people to work in a different place.
So you're saying that rural areas suffer from teacher shortages. Is that what you're?
Tremendous, tremendous.
Kate, we have a question from Joseph Olchewski.
Hi, Joseph.
Hi, Kate. Thanks for all your great work on this issue. I really have two questions, and I generally agree with your sad story of kind of these performance issues that you're seeing out in the teacher prep area. So my first question is, so who's doing this well? Where do we look for hope? Where do we look for kind of a role model? Who should we be modeling ourselves after? That's question number one. And then number two, I guess I'd be interested in any comments you have regarding Teach for America and these teacher shortages, and especially in hard to staff areas, and kind of their own issues regarding certification of their core members. So those are my two questions. Thank you.
Great, good, great questions. Depends on, there are role models for every single policy problem or solution that you can come up with. But so let's, what do you want? A role model for compensation? That would be Dallas, Texas, and Washington, D.C. There were a number of places that were experimenting with different compensation, but as soon as the leadership changed, like in Newark, New Mexico, other places like that, Denver, which wasn't doing a great job with compensation, but at least it wasn't, it wasn't same old, same old. But so the experiments that we saw rise in the past 5, 10, 15 years, there were some very good ones. But I think, people don't talk about Washington, D.C., how that pay structure has really essentially been institutionalized. It has survived now 3 new superintendents since Michelle Reed. So it's part of their lifeblood. And so it's amazing what they've done there, and others just kind of ignore it. Now, what's going on in Dallas is extremely, that is spreading through the state. I don't know how much limited dollars will have an impact on that, but the state got behind the results in Dallas, Texas, and you're seeing they're seeing incredible growth in student achievement in that state, in Dallas, as a result of paying teachers more to work in the schools where the kids need those teachers. So so that's a couple of compensation models. I don't know if you had a broader question, but I would address Teach for America. And
well, Kate, all I wanted to get at is it's like talking about school districts. No one has really mastered all of these issues, and you do have to kind of cherry pick Dallas here and Washington, D.C. there. And I was just hoping you had an exemplar that there was kind of either a district or a state that really has kind of put the package together.
Well, I would, if you're talking about compensation, I think DC and Dallas have done that. If you're talking about all aspects of teaching, no, nobody. Yeah. But I'm not sure I'll ever be in a position to say that a district has done it all. But I would say that, and we're now on a down curve. There's no question. I mean,
I completely agree. Thank you.
In regards to Teach for America, look, I bought Teach for America to Baltimore when I worked for a foundation in the 90s. I am a huge fan of what the gift that Teach for America has given this country in terms of its leadership. And so everything I say that is going to give you some facts about it should be considered in the context that I think they've been a real asset to public education. They're expensive, you know. We've done an analysis. You know, Teach for America is $72,000 a candidate, and it costs District 0 to get a teacher from traditional teacher prep. You may say, well, it's worth $72,000, and it might be. I can make that case, but I do think that we need to realize that the alternative models that are out there, they range from low 30s at the cheapest to up to $98,000 per candidate. And there's no way to scale up at that level. So if you added up all the relays, TNTP, TFA, Woodrow Wilson, Urban Teach, if you added all those up, you're still only at less than 10% of all the new teachers that are hired in a given year.
So Kate, we have a couple, three other questions out here, and I do want to give Catherine Merseth an opportunity because she has done a lot of training of teachers at Harvard. Yeah. And so, Catherine, would you like to?
Thank you, Paul. Thank you.
Yeah.
It's wonderful to see you and hear you, Kate. I really appreciate the work that you do.
And you as well.
Two questions. One was a further on question about Teach for America and the quality of the candidates, which has been, as you well know, a long concern of mine. Also the tenure that, you know, they will stay for 2 years and then go off and do something else and leave some of our most vulnerable students adrift. But more broadly, and this may be moving us too far ahead from where you are in the conversation today, but I was wondering in this era of COVID, what you think COVID and the remote teaching and the craziness about whether kids are back in school or on a screen, what do you think it will do to the quality of our teacher candidates and our teachers?
So to answer your first question with the quality of Teach for America, you know, there's certainly more, you know, their academic aptitude is quite good. If you look at the results that they get in the classroom, they're mixed. Certainly they seem to have an impact on mathematics, but not very much. I don't think Teach for America is any better at, and they may not be as good as some in training teachers to teach reading. You know, I could really get on my high horse if you want to talk about our inability to train teachers in the United States to teach reading. I can't help but call it malpractice, what's going on in most programs. So, you know, Teach for America, my bottom line is they are a tremendous asset to public education, but that does not mean they're a tremendous asset to teaching. And if you can sort of distinguish between the two. And then, you know, they don't stay. If they just stayed, you know, if Teach for America were a 3-year program, you would see their, you could almost justify the cost benefit more clearly, because they definitely, in some of the research literature, you see a bump up in the 3rd year. That's not true for other teachers. So, but anyway, I think all of these alternative programs have allowed an important part of the, you know, philanthropic community, important part of the states and districts to not deal with what they really need to deal with, and that is to improve traditional teacher prep. Everybody throws up their hands at it, and believe me, I get the temptation because this has been my life's work, and there are more days where I want to throw up my hands than there are days where I'm jumping up and down. But yeah, I think, you know, I think we absolutely have got to wrestle to the ground what's wrong with traditional teacher prep.
So a question here from Susie Wang, who's been a faithful part of our community for quite a long time. Susie, would you like to pose the question?
Sure. Thanks so much, Paul. It's great to see you, and Antonio too. And Kate, thanks so much for coming here today. Even virtually, it's really exciting to hear you speak. So I just had a question about how you balance teacher compensation incentives with score inflation and cheating. So this issue has been well documented, even in DC and in, you know, more high profile cases like Atlanta. And so I'm just curious from your perspective, if there is a way to avoid score inflation while still using value add teacher measures. And just to clarify what I mean by score inflation, I mean gains on high stakes tests, but then not comparable gains on the NAEP, for example.
Right. So yeah, I would say that the cheating that occurred in DC was on graduation. It was on allowing kids to graduate who hadn't shown up for school, more than it was about cheating on any licensing on the state assessments. But you know, I think that the answer there is to not make the state tests the majority metric. That there is also reasoned judgment, and that's certainly the way that DC has gone. They were at 50%, and now they're at, I believe, 35% for the assessment. So as long as you have multiple measures where you can have checks and you're looking at data, I mean, you know, the problem is the school districts don't have a culture of looking at their own data. So you know, that's how you catch cheaters, you know. But and I realized I did not address Dr. Mercer's other question about COVID, but do you want me to go back to that, or is there a follow-up?
Sure, go. We have one more question in the queue here, but why don't you respond to that COVID question?
Yeah, I think that I prefer to put see a silver lining with COVID. You know, as awful as it is, I'm hoping that it serves as a disruptor. I know it served as a disruption, but I'm hoping that that it brings, you know, for example, I hope that that we've all gotten over our technology hump, and that COVID will, in the long run, be a solution for rural schools. Their inability to get a math or science teacher, and that we'll do that more and more of that remotely. In terms of how we change teacher prep, I'm not as, you know, I'm probably too old to have a really good savvy answer about that, because I think that the generation that's come through has no problem figuring out how to use technology to do whatever it is they want to do. So I'm less bullish on I'm more focused on the fact that teachers aren't learning how to teach reading and they're not getting enough math than I am about giving them more technology as part of their preparation so that they can do more teaching by Zoom. But I don't know if that answer is too flippant. It may be.
So we have another question here from Ira Stoll. Ira, your question is much too long for me to ask, so you're going to have to ask it yourself.
Thanks. There's been sort of a bipartisan pushback against occupational licensing requirements in some other fields. And I wonder whether, the complaints are that they restrict the labor supply, they're a guild effort to restrict competition. They function as a way of preventing minorities from entering a field. I wonder if you see teacher licensing exams at all in that context. I mean, what would you say to someone who said teacher license test pass rate is kind of irrelevant to K-12 student learning, and the better thing to do would be to just get rid of the licensing requirements and open up the field to, say, people who know math and science well but don't want to spend a year or two in an education school or preparing to take a licensing test. I mean, that's how the private schools, some of them do it. And when parents have a choice, often that they will make the choice to send their children to learn from unlicensed teachers.
Right. So, I'm glad you asked that question because I love answering it. It's really, really timely. There's no question that there are a lot of people who are calling into question the value or purpose of licensing tests. And I know there's a book coming out next February that provides plenty of evidence that they think that teacher licensing tests have been used to discriminate and suppress the number of Black and Brown teachers in this country. And so they look at the history of why licensing tests even came about, and they extend that into a modern day. The reason I don't, here's my issue is that anyone who's looked at, for example, the basic skills test, which is roughly 8th grade reading and writing, and it went through a process of here's some math you need to do to be a teacher. You need to be able to grade a paper, figure out percentages. You need to be able to interpret data. And in that process of basic skills, you take the test if you've ever taken it, and you can't imagine somebody who can't pass that test being allowed in the classroom. Actually, it's just basic literacy and numeracy. And but that said, I have no problem with people deciding that licensing tests are a waste of time, but then replace it with something else. And nobody's doing that. We've seen huge numbers of states pull away from basic skills tests because they think because they serve as such a barrier for Black and Brown teachers. And I get that impulse, but do we think that we're doing right by Black and Brown kids putting teachers in their classrooms who can't pass those basic levels? And then the same goes for content knowledge. I don't think if you were to ask any parent in the country if they wanted a teacher in the classroom who didn't, him or herself, know the subject. I mean, we've never had that debate before in education, that a teacher shouldn't have to know their subject, but we do now. And, the alternatives just don't seem to, they don't seem to manifest themselves. But I also think, and my last point I will say is, I think there is no preparation for these tests other than what you've learned in college or whatever. So it's not like this is a licensure barrier in that respect. You're saying, well, nobody wants to spend, why not just hire science and math people rather than make them take this test? Well, if they know science and math, they're not going to have any problem taking these tests. They're not particularly difficult. So, and it's not like they have to go back to school to prepare to take them. they are not the barrier that we need to worry about. The barrier is asking people to spend 2 years taking courses that don't necessarily make them a more effective teacher. And that's my campaign. But I think licensing tests serve a valid purpose. But I know that's not the popular answer right now.
Okay, so we have a question again from Austin Batson. Austin, you want to pose your question?
Sure, I'd be happy to, but I actually might change it based off of what you just said, Kate. You mentioned that the 2-year programs are more the barrier than the tests. So, and I apologize, I'm not very familiar with your research, but would this mean that you're open to anyone just who can come in and pass the tests, being able to go in and serve as a teacher the next day?
I used to be, and then I found out, no, this is my whole, people think I'm either for or against teacher education. This is my bottom line. There is so much content that would benefit any person, no matter how smart they are, that would benefit any person in preparation to teach. That wasn't even true 30 years ago. But you know, what we know about classroom management, what we know about what we need to teach teachers about how people learn, reading instruction, mathematics. You know, I started with reading instruction. I conceded that 25 years ago, and I said, okay, so just teach teachers how to teach reading and let anyone in the classroom who's halfway smart. And but I've revisited my opinion about this. The problem is right now is that most teacher preparation programs in the United States are not delivering that content. So I'm very sympathetic to anyone who wants to do a short circuit that process. But in the long run, it's not good for teaching. It's not good for the teaching profession. And so we need to lift the quality of these 1,450 programs in the country. And then, you know, I've had this argument with folks from Teach for America, and it depends on who's in charge there, but much of leadership now will concede that if teacher prep were what it needed to be, then they would argue, yes, we shouldn't exist.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. That really answered the question. And that kind of led into my original question. What are the successful programs doing that the unsuccessful programs aren't doing so much?
They're paying attention to what's evidence-based, and they're paying attention to quality control in terms of clinical practice. There's evidence-based content in almost any area of professional knowledge that didn't exist 20, 30 years ago. We've benefited so much from cognitive psychology and other fields, and then high quality practice.
Thank you very much.
So let me echo that, Kate. This has been a fabulous seminar for me, and I think for our audience more generally. So we appreciate your taking the time to share your years of experience and your in-depth knowledge of the whole field of teacher preparation. Thank you.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
So please do come to our seminar next Thursday when we will have Michelle Rhee. Kate talked about Michelle Rhee, and we'll have Michelle Rhee and the person with whom she negotiated the transformation of the compensation system and the teacher evaluation system in the District of Columbia, which has endured down to the present. So I think you will find next week's seminar equally interesting. Thank you all for coming.